It's coming from that universalist comparative praxis and study of universal ethics, but it's, you know, anchored here in this. I mean, each lineage has its own anchorage, but my own particular traditions in European thought go back, as I say, to the Pythagorean, Orphic and Platonic schools. So, anyway, it was a fascinating discussion. Thank you to all the amazing American classical scholars who were sharing. It was like sitting in on a conversation in a, you know, a senior common room at a university. But there was a sort of almost a kind of slight despair in the tone, because some of them were saying, well, how do we get this message across to ordinary people? Here we are, you know, we know all the details of all this stuff from the ancient world, professors of classics, but, you know, how do we get this across to the crowd that's marching on you know, the Capitol on the 6th of January? One of the shocking things was a very good paper by a chap who spoke about the, you know, the Battle of Thermopylae and Leonidas and the Spartans, who briefly held off the vast might of the Persian army. And he explained how that entered mythology as a sort of heroic resistance by the Greeks believing in freedom, and became part of the sort of vocabulary of Westernism. And now it's being used by right-wing groups. And he explained, I was shocked and didn't know this, that some of the people up on the Capitol assault on the 6th of January were using Spartan language and symbols and had little badges and so on, that they were identifying themselves as the new Leonidas. They saw themselves, I mean, totally bonkers, but, you know, these QAnon types see themselves as the final defense of Thermopylae against those horrible hordes of Persianizing liberals or whatever. I mean, they've psyched themselves up into a kind of bubble of yeah, I don't know, they've had a lobotomy of the mirror neurons, it seems to me, and created a sort of dark conspiratorial worldview. And it was also a very good talk by some other academics about we need to move from kind of monotheist or mono-narratives, what I call monomaniacal narratives, where there's only one veracity, one truth, to a sort of pluriverse, where there's a parallel set of discourses going on, and we're allowed to have those plural discourses going on. But that doesn't happen in the world of the Capitol rioter, no. And it's this feeling of, you know, it's our last stand. Anyway, there are profound psychological issues here. And I think, again, philosophy as therapy in the Socratic sense, our duty as philosophers is to bring people on, to educate them, to bring them out of that paranoid world into the realization that the very thing they're railing against, liberalism, is in fact precisely the freedom of thought to be able to hold ideas without having to consent to them, as Aristotle said. He said the mark of an intelligent mind is the ability to weigh and hold hypotheses without having to consent to them. And this reminds me of a great Jain scholar who, you know, I've been studying in the last week, and in my work on religious maths, and who was one of, I think, the greatest Jain philosophers that history has recorded. I met Acharya Tulsi in Mahapragya, and my friend Dr. S.L. Gandhi has written a wonderful biography of Mahapragya, who I think is this guy's equal, probably. I wish I, you know, had longer to talk to Mahapragya when he was alive. I would have discussed it. But they have a great deal in common, it seems to me. Now, I'm just trying to find the actual quote because I don't want to give false information here. Bear with me a second, because the actual words that this Jain scholar uses are very important. And I wrote them in my notebook. Yes, so, okay, so he was called Yashovijaya, Yashovijaya. He lived from 1624 to 1688. And he was born in Gujarat and studied with a famous teacher, Muni Nayavijaya. And then he sent him, his teacher told him to go to Varanasi, a Hindu stronghold, and learn Sanskrit, which he did, and to study Sanskrit logic and intellectual activity, and he did. And he wrote a total of over 100 works in his lifetime, in both Sanskrit and Gujarati. And he died finally at about the age of 80 in Gujarat. Now, he integrated and he knew both the Svetambara Jain traditions, which is the kind that I've encountered and met, which are the sort of reformed Jainism, if you want. They wear white. The old school Jainism, Digambara, who are naked. He also knew, obviously, Hinduism. He understood the Vedanta exactly. He understood Sankhya philosophy and different schools of yoga. He understood the Mimamsa logical traditions. He also understood Buddhism and had met Buddhists and encountered, you know, the Buddhological critique of other schools. And so he wrote some profound works in his book called Jnanasara, The Path of Knowledge, Jnana. He described 32 moral and intellectual virtues that, if you're serious about enlightenment and the purification of humanity and this cathartic denouement that we need for mankind, you have to follow these 32 moral and intellectual virtues. You know, this is deep stuff, and one of them is called madhyasthata, which means neutrality. So you have to be able to be, I mean, Buddhists call it equanimity. In the Vipassana tradition, it's called equanimity. It's the same virtue, I think. It's coming from a transpersonal or transcendental place so that you don't give assent to either of the warring parties. But neutrality of that kind is not the same as indifference. And, you know, this is a complicated conversation, but even Krishna took sides in the Mahabharata war. He didn't fight, but he helped Yudhishthira's, you know, and Arjuna. He was the charioteer. He wouldn't actually get engaged, but he helped with advice. He was acting as a druid, because that's what a druid does. They don't fight, they don't, you know, throw weapons, but they can give advice to the kings and the warriors, but only to the righteous ones, and they know which are the righteous side. So that's, yeah, neutral as in I'm not fighting ahimsa, but I'm on the side of righteousness and justice. That's Krishna's point. And another of the great 32 moral and intellectual virtues is Sarvanayasraya. Sarvanayasraya, which means in Sanskrit a groundedness in all viewpoints. So this is, you know, it's not enough to be a sort of a promoter of one particular ideology or one particular viewpoint, because all viewpoints are valid. You know, the early Muslims around Muhammad, they had their insight, their download. They called it Islam. You know, it was valid for them in their viewpoint, in their time. The early disciples around Christ, they had their amazing experience of, you know, the Holy Spirit and the descent of the dove, and wow, you know, this is the Messiah walking with us, and it totally, that was their viewpoint. Buddhists had their enlightenment experience with Buddha, and, you know, wow, there's a Buddha. I mean, you know, it must have been amazing. And so what our Jain scholar is saying is that you have to know all this. You have to be grounded in all viewpoints. Now that's the point of my periodic table of the religious and philosophical systems. If this Jain was alive now, you know, I would share with him the details of this, and all what I've tried to do in this periodic table is put all the religious, all the philosophical, all the epistemological and the ethical viewpoints in a scientific way, Because we can't be scientific about philosophy and religion until we do that. You know, I've made an attempt at it, and obviously it needs tweaking. There's always new things one finds out, but I think the basic structure is sound. And Yasha Vijaya would I think, you know, say, fantastic. Get that into every school, every college, every university, faculty of philosophy and religious studies and ethics in the world, whatever the religion of the place, and get them studying it. This is a scientific thing. You see, the Jain position on God is, or gods, is, yes, they exist. They are winds in the you know, turbocharged collective unconscious that blows through us all, makes us all telepathic in dreamland. But, and you know, the gods are forms that we can project onto that, say the form of fire. Heraclitus had a lot in common with Moses. They saw the fire form of God, and the Shaivite, the fire worshippers, who keep that tradition going, the Havan. And we have one of those in our World Intellectual Forum meetings, you know. Fire is a pretty good way of seeing God face to face, if you think about it. But it's just one of the forms. And beyond that, there's the invisible, the blue, the ether, the oxygen in which it's burning. So, so this Jain, I think, was a very, very profound thinker. And that universality of views. I mean, that's actually what everyone should do. You know, you don't have to change your religion. You don't have to change your philosophy. You can stay a Marxist or a, you know, whatever. Just become more universal in your views and study them all so that you realise you can situate yourself. Now, to me, that's the purpose of the World Intellectual Forum's work. And it's the point of what... I think if we can do that, we can make cathartic history work for us. Instead of being its victim, and I think the tragedy, and it wasn't really addressed in the conference, I mean it was 3 days, they couldn't do everything, but there's a whole puzzle that's left to me, is at what point did catharsis stop being this kind of Pythagorean purification of the soul, Socratic purification of the soul, and become a sort of agenda for mass killing and bombing? At what point did humans become so impoverished ethically that they thought catharsis can be achieved through violence and through killing and through... One of the tragic papers was on what's called ravaging warfare, which is when tribal groups attack each other, and what they do is they kill all the men and they then rape the women. And this is called winning. This is called victory, you know, because then the children of the women, you bring them up in your tribe and you beat and bully them into becoming whatever it is, you know, following your tribe or your race. That's not winning. That's the complete opposite. That's losing the plot of authentic history. So somewhere along the line, humans thought that violence is the way to bring about catharsis. It's a false catharsis, obviously. The people that attacked the Capitol were imbued with that, you know. We'll attack, we'll hang Pence, we'll, you know, whatever, kill the senators, and we'll do the catharsis America needs to repurify itself. You know, and this is the sort of false narrative of militarism. But it's very, very, you know, it's there in the British Army regiment stories. We were there, you know, Inkerman, we fought at the Battle of the Somme, we fought in, you know, the Battle of the Bulge, we did D-Day, you know, they still trot around Horse Guards Parade and all their regimental finery. I mean, I had a grandfather who was in all that, in the Boer War. I have photographs of him in his uniform. He was in the Coldstream Guards. He was a household cavalry, actually. You know, prancing around on a horse in Whitehall, protecting the monarch. I mean, they believed in all that generation, but I'm his grandson. I've grown out of that stuff, you know. That's not, we shouldn't be doing war games anymore. Unfortunately, some people are stuck at it institutionally, and that's where sociology is needed to have a counter-tradition to the ignorance that's perpetuating warfare. Military capitalism continues to call the shots, and now it does it through information warfare. and it promotes its big business of finance and militarism. I was very disappointed in Biden ordering that assassination on Syria, killing a few Muslims. Just like a few hours after he'd spoken to Mohammed bin Salman, who the CIA have now said categorically, absolutely ordered the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, come on, Biden. You were elected because you were the moral guy, and here you are talking to this thug, this murderer, and then you authorise killing Syrians. I mean, what on earth's going on? Have they stuck a chip in your brain already? I mean, come on, Biden. That's not good enough. You need to rethink that. And his refusal to call out bin Salman is, I think, scandalous. Now, why has he done that? Why is America afraid to call out bin Salman? I wonder. I don't know. I'm just going to have a little look at this book called American Compromat, in which I read that Mohammed bin Salman was a close friend of Jeffrey Epstein. What? Yes, a close friend of Jeffrey Epstein. Mohammed bin Salman was hanging out in New York with the guy that was getting all the photographs and videos on every politician, every aristocrat of dubious ethics. So bin Salman has probably got all the compromat, right? So no wonder they daren't call him out, because the next day their career will be over. Oh dear, oh dear. You see why we need catharsis? How deep this rot goes? Maybe Khashoggi had found this out and was trying to blow the whistle on bin Salman. Discuss, we'll never know. I would have interviewed him for the World Intellectual Forum if he was around. And bin Salman, if you want to be interviewed for the World Intellectual Forum, fine. You can justify your friendship with Epstein, and you can explain why you think attacking Shias is the way to be a righteous Muslim. I don't. I've read the Quran too. I am a surrendered Sufi soul in love with God. I know you're wrong. Bashing Shias is not the way forward. Sorry, mate. I want to move on to the next point, really, which is cathartic history is what we need as a peace form. People like bin Laden, him too, but bin Salman, what they need is a catharsis from this wish to do violence into a moral reform and the wish to do peace. It's what St. Paul had to go through. One of the papers at the Cathartic Conference on history was about St. Paul. I missed that one, sadly. And it's kind of what I put in my book my thesis on transpersonal history. What I'm arguing in the methodology of transpersonal history, by integrating historical science with transpersonal psychology, we can begin to talk in a mature way about what form of catharsis is open to us, both individually and collectively. How can we purify history of these sins? How can America, it's not just like, oh, we got Biden in, great, everyone can go home. No, the ongoing struggle for righteousness and truth continues. In Britain, it's horrendous. We have, as I said at the very beginning, we have a ruler, Mr. Johnson, that is unethical and pre-ethical. He hasn't got a clue about the need for a catharsis through peace and truth. His vision is he's been robotized by a sort of a dark worldview that has no ethics. And he bears the same hallmarks of psychopathology that Trump did. Another thing to mention is another thing from the conference talking about catharsis and Aristotelian interpretations of drama, but it applies to history. In the Poetics is this notion of an ironic reversal of fortunes. It's a feature in both tragedy but also comedy. And it's a lovely Greek word, peripeteia, which means this a peripateia is a wandering about, the peripatetic school of Aristotelian philosophy, which in a sort of way I suppose I kind of, I'm a great lover and fan of that tradition, and I've sat in the Lyceum at a conference in the World Congress of Philosophy in 2013. We were treated to a lecture by a brilliant scholar of Greek philosophy in the actual place where Aristotle taught. I mean, it's amazing to be there, sitting on a wall in the beautiful evening Athenian sunshine, talking to a philosopher from St. Petersburg, a Russian Buddhologist, would you believe? The peripatetics were pretty amazing, and I learned some wonderful stuff about this conference. I didn't know this, but Philip of Macedon apparently ravaged Stagira, where Aristotle came from, his hometown up in Macedonia. And it was pretty much destroyed, which I hadn't known before. And apparently Aristotle managed to get it resettled. And he talked the successor, Alexander, into having a nicer attitude to Stagira, who resettled it and allowed it to live happily ever after. And it's still going as a little town. I'd love to go on pilgrimage one day. And so Aristotle was regarded as the second founder of Stagira. I didn't know that. I'm assuming that the sources are there that indicate this is factual. And I think it shows that he knew the horrors of war, did Aristotle. He was in favour of, if possible, a peaceful orientation. And I think that was the whole point of his teaching. That was the reason for the Lyceum. That's why in France we call the schools lycées, still after that. If we can solve a problem through intellectual work, through dialectic, through study, through research, it's always much better than through just hacking each other to bits. I mean, that doesn't solve a problem. It creates hundreds of more problems. And so, hats off really to that. And the ironic reversal of history is kind of what Brexit's about, isn't it? Because plucky England leads the way, charging out of the European Union because it's a heroic nation of great souls who did the Battle of Inkerman and dropped bombs on Dresden, and they're God's chosen people. What? The Celts aren't with us? Oh, what? The Scots want to leave us now? Oh, well, can't have that. So the irony of this is that exactly that same attitude, well, if you take that position, then logically, of course the Scots can leave the UK. The UK is a corrupt, ridiculous, unethical regime country taken over by Windsor maniacs. So of course you're going to be a brave Scot and leave it. And you're going to be a brave Irish soul and reunify your island and, rejoin Europe and become a sane and sensible country and get rid of these fanatics. So we're seeing with the Brexit aftermath, and although it's being clawed back and, every trick in the trade of false media and social warfare, social intelligence warfare is being deployed by the British elites and their military capitalist overlords, it's touch and go whether the UK will survive. I've always said since day one Brexit was a nightmare, because why risk the stability of the UK as a progressive, decent country with certain values and so on over a chimera called Brexit, which is obviously against the national interest. It's beyond any rational or logical possible grounds of explanation. So we're watching this peripateia in action. Another thinker that pointed this out was Hegel, in his own way, borrowing some ideas from Jacob Boehme and other philosophers, in his concept of the dialectic of history. What Hegel was trying to do, and some of the ideas were taken up by Marx, but he missed a lot of the argument, is that history itself moves in zigzags. It's not a sort of straight line. We're seeing that with Brexit, and it goes there, it goes there, it goes there. I mean, my view is that it's going to zigzag around till an independent Scotland, a united Ireland, and finally a a ravaged and very chastened England and Wales eventually rejoin Europe, and we can all get back to where we were, 6 years ago as one happy continent. I mean, yeah, history is so full of ironies, as Hegel in his own way pointed out. And now a lot of this is based, and the other thing I want to report that I've been doing this week is I finally published our Mary Magdalene Studies Association journal, which you can now get on my publisher. It's 100 pages, jam-packed with really interesting stuff that's coming out about Mary Magdalene. Why bother with Mary Magdalene, you say? Well, because she was probably very close to Jesus. Jesus had a huge impact on history and is revered and respected in the largest religion on the planet, Christianity in all its forms, but also in Islam, which is the second biggest religion on the planet. Between those two religions, it's half the entire world's population. And they both revere Jesus as a prophet, a messenger, a Rasul. In sort of antiquated Byzantine language, that's the Son of God, which was a Greek phrase taken from Greek religion, pagan religion. Alexander the Great was the son of God. Dionysus was the son of God. Anyone who was anybody was the son of God. It just meant like a really amazing person. So finding out, it's like when you're trying to look at a star, if you sometimes look over there, you see the star better out in the corner of your eye. And it's the same with Jesus. He's such an extraordinary figure, we can't really make out who he was. If we look at Mary Magdalene, I think a lot of things fall into place. But of course, tracking who Mary Magdalene was and what she did is tricky. She's mentioned in the Gospels, she's mentioned in other texts, but you have to put them all together and put the pieces. It's like a mosaic. And she's mentioned particularly in the Gnostic tradition. We know that she was the first witness to the resurrection. Well, wow, I mean, what on earth happened? How did it happen? Did she see Jesus in the garden walking about, on the Sunday? I mean, I'd really like to interview her, basically. And as a scholar of early Christianity, I've done the best thing I can, which is reading every single book, journal, article, PhD that I can find on Mary Magdalene, including the arts. Now, when I came to France, I was very moved because I discovered that, there's a living tradition in France, a tradition that Mary Magdalene herself came here after the resurrection. She escaped in time, unlike Bruce Chilton, who thinks she died in Galilee during the Rome-Jewish wars mentioned by Josephus. These French esotericists say no, she got out in time and escaped to Gaul, and she had maybe land, relatives, property, I don't know, but somehow she got here. And there's a continuous tradition that is the case. And the Catholic tradition is strong on this, that yes, and they can point to the cave where she ended up on a kind of retreat. Others say that she also visited the Pyrenees, and they revere her memory there. And so, again, I suspend judgment. This is an academic body to try and get to the root of all this. I mean, even if it's not true, even if the Gaul legends are not true, they're true in the sense that they exist as legends, going right back to, I think, the 500s as some of the earliest written references to this. And so they're very ancient. And of course then by the 1200s they find her actual body and they find her tomb. And she's now in a cathedral in the south of France. And part of her was put in Vézelay, which is a basilica not far from here, which I'd been to when we went on pilgrimage after the founding of the Mary Magdalene Studies Association. So, it's a big job, this, and fortunately we have a few hundred members, 1,000 or more members on our Facebook group. We have people that are interested in Mary Magdalene studies popping up out of the woodwork, and we've had some lively conferences. Last year it had to be on Zoom. We'll have another one on July 22nd on Zoom. And if that's something you're interested in and want to join in with, write to me, email me. And look at the journal. It's a labour of love. I've been helped by colleagues, thank you very much to all of them, and I'll continue to do it. Now, the Gnostic tradition is important, I think. These Cathars, the pure ones of the south of France, the Pyrenees, what did they know? What was their story? I think it's very interesting, and I think Mary Magdalene's gospel and teaching were very Gnostic, actually, in flavour. Now, I don't think, I think it was a great mistake to think the Catholic Church and the Gnostic Church should fight. I wouldn't have allowed that if I'd been in incarnation at the time. I would have tried to organise sort of philosophical seminars and discussions. Actually, St Dominic tried. There were attempts to bring Catherine de Foix and the others to debate, but I don't know, I think the scholarship wasn't there. There wasn't enough learning to make possible a peace treaty. I've now written the Interfaith Peace Treaty as an attempt to have that dialogue now and get the world's rival polarised sects who can't see the irony of history. They're stuck in the blood and guts to sign up to the peace treaty and study each other's stories, because at the end of the day these are just different stories. Now, one of the most amazing texts the Cathars and the Gnostics have is called the Secret Book of John. And I'm going to just share a little bit about this, because John, in John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, is a very, very deep Gospel. If you listen to my commentary on the entire history of and writing and meaning of John's Gospel, which is on my Global Green University site, you'll see, I've mused a great deal about this. And John was definitely a kind of Gnostic in his own way, but an orthodox Catholic Gnostic. But what is there behind that gospel? Now, these writings that we know as Gnostic were sadly forced out by the official bureaucrats who took over the running of the church. I think the tragedy that happened to Christianity is that it became a power. It was adopted by the Roman Empire, who then perverted it and used it for its own ends. And it ends up becoming a sort of justification of militarism and capitalism, as it's happened with the British establishment. The same person runs the church as runs the army. I mean, that's kind of not what Christ intended, I somehow think. If the world is going to perish with nuclear weapons, the Queen has written this thing saying, "Fire all the bombs, lads," and the guy on the nuclear submarine presses the button and 50 cities go up in thermonuclear horror. No, that's not the Christ way. I think the Queen should make a choice. Is she on the Christ path of gnosis and wisdom, or is she just a sort of megalomaniac, let's destroy the world while we can type person? I have actually met the Queen. I think she's actually deep down a good person. And she should actually, reread these Gospels maybe. But also, I think the Gnostic scriptures should be put back in the Bible. These wonderful texts, the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and the book I'm going to read from, the Secret Book of John, and many, many others, they give a richness. It's like a 3D texture to the other Gospels. And although Paul's letters are absolutely superb, again, they only really make sense against the Gnostic texture. Paul himself was definitely a Gnostic. And the word gnosis simply means knowledge in Greek. It was the common language word for knowledge. So, to go around saying, well, I'm a Gnostic Christian, is just, I'm someone that loves knowledge. I've studied, I'm enlightened, I'm learned, I'm erudite. The Latin equivalent was eruditas. It meant to be learned. So, here's my quote from it. One day, when John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, went up to the temple, it happened that a Pharisee named Ananias